Hi, I'm Mike Geppa, and on today's Whiteboard Wednesday, I want to talk to you about the intersection of three circles that are of great importance and the need for us to be, as leaders, to be right in the sweet spot. And the circles are faith and wisdom and prayer. And I'm thinking specifically about key decisions that we have to make, strategic decisions, important decisions, but any decision that we make that has a lot of significance to it, it's a good place to try and get to. It's right in the middle, the overlap of faith meeting wisdom meeting prayer. So let's think about this just a little bit, and we're going to skim, because each of these obviously could be in themselves an extended sermon series. The Bible has a lot to say about faith, wisdom, and prayer. I will have a little to say about each. So regarding faith, let's start here with Hebrews 11:1, which says that faith is confidence in what we hope for, in assurance in what we don't see. So it's just a little reminder that that's the nature of faith. It's what we don't see, but we believe it to be true. And then secondly, Hebrews 11:6 is another great reminder that without faith, it is impossible to please God. It's not improbable, it's not unlikely, it's impossible. So as leaders, we have to bring a measure of faith into our decision making. If we're just putting it on autopilot and saying, well, show us the proof every single time, every T crossed, every I dotted, that's a faithless approach that God will not bless. And then thirdly, and yet another great reminder, this one from Ephesians 5:16 that says, make the most of every opportunity. And in this case, we need to think as leaders about the things that God puts before us, whether it be people or ministries or whatever those things are. But God does this, and he puts things in front of us, and we have the ability, or at least the option, of whether or not we want to step in and pursue those things. And then there's wisdom. And again, wisdom is all-encompassing. I'm just going to touch on a couple of aspects that I believe are important for this. First of all, stewardship. And stewardship in itself is all-encompassing, but here we're talking about just plain old good stewardship of the resources that God has given us. So our finances, our people, our buildings, our property, all of that is it's important that we steward that well as wise stewards and for the glory of God. So just a reminder that part of being a wise person is to be a good steward. And then recollection and observation. The recollection part of that is simply this. That is, you go through the pages of Scripture, you can barely find a page, you won't find a page, where God hasn't done something very powerfully throughout the course of time. It doesn't take much to go through and go, wow, God did that, and God did this, and God is still at work. And that's why observation is important too, because God is working right now in your life and in the life of your church. And so as you recall how God has worked throughout history, but also how God has worked in your church, make sure that you're observing at the same time, because God is still at work in your life and in your church. And the wise person takes note of that. And then thirdly is to count the cost. You know the scripture, Jesus says, who among you would build a tower without first counting the cost? And as it relates to leadership decisions, even as we're people of faith and we want to be bold and risk-taking, we also want to know what it is we're signing up for. So Luke 14:28, count the cost. That's important as well. And finally, there's prayer. And we're to pray at all times and through all circumstances. We know that the scripture tells us in Philippians 4:6 says, do not worry about anything, instead pray about everything. So that's pretty overarching. So the scripture tells us, be people of prayer, be leaders who are praying about key decisions. And then finally, a good word from Isaiah 30, verse 21, which says this, and your ears shall hear a word behind you saying, this is the way, walk in it. And so in other words, if we're earnest in our prayer, if we're saying, God, show us what you would have us do, and we're listening, even if it's the counsel of one another, which is also biblical, we believe in faith as leaders that God will give us what we need. Thanks for listening.